Hello, students. This is the follow-up video that I've made about the television industry, which I admit is very confusing. I admit it's very confusing for me, and I've been studying this stuff for many, many years, so I can only imagine how confusing it is for you. Maybe people who've only just recently started to pay attention to television as a business, the industry side of things, not just the programming, entertainment side of things. So what I'm going to play is a portion of a podcast. It's an interview with a guy called Chris Grimes. Chris Grimes is a reporter for the Financial Times. He is based now in Los Angeles, and he covers one of the things that he covers is the entertainment industry. And he does a podcast or an interview about peak TV. Peak TV is a term that people have been using for a couple of years now. The idea being that there's just too much content available to consumers, and there's going to be a retraction. We're going to see a shrinking. I mean, there's traditional broadcast television, there's traditional cable television, and now there's all these streaming services. Plus, there's things like YouTube as well. There's just so much content out there that we're going to see a retraction. And a consolidation in the industry that we can't have, a million or a zillion different players. We're going to go back to something like the old Hollywood studio system, where a handful of maybe 3 or 4 companies dominate all of the content production. Everyone predicts that there will be some type of retraction eventually. Anyway, so peak TV comes up. And just to go over, you should have gotten some of this from the previous lecture and material, but just to go over broadcast television, this is the original form of television, makes money from commercials. That is the way money is made. The production companies make TV shows which air on broadcast networks. Then the production companies then sell them. This is called syndication, where you get a bunch of shows and reruns. Seinfeld was a big hit. Everybody Loves Raymond, that 70s show. Friends, these are all big hits in the syndication market. That's still very, very profitable. So that industry still exists. You also have cable television. Cable television does have ads, but it also has subscriptions where people pay money to subscribe to these channels. And many channels exist only because they get these things called carriage fees. I talked about that already. Carriage fees are money that's paid to a cable channel based on the number of subscribers that exist in a certain market. It doesn't matter if people in San Diego watch Home and Garden, for example. If that's on the cable lineup, then Home and Garden is going to get X number of dollars or X number of cents for every person. Okay, that's carriage fees. Now, the streaming services make money from subscriptions because they're selling that content directly to you. And if you're not a subscriber, you cannot watch it. There's just no option of watching it. And now the streaming services are also starting to add commercials as well. So we have these different revenue streams, different people competing. Things that air on broadcast television and go into the syndication market can show up on a streaming channel. So you have a couple of companies in Hollywood battling it out, trying to figure out who is going to be the ruler of the new media landscape now that streaming is taking over. So a lot of this is very inside baseball, as it were, but I think you'll get something out of it. I've tried to throw some visuals on the screen, so you're not just sitting there staring at a computer screen listening to a podcast. It's less than 20 minutes. Maybe it's like 16, 17 minutes long. Anyway, stay tuned to the end, because there is a photograph of me, yours truly, and Chris Grimes. I think the photograph, I'm going to guess it's from sometime in the spring, maybe early summer, 1990, I'm going to guess. Charleston, South Carolina. That's what I think. My memory of 32 years ago is not particularly fresh or sharp, but that's where I think the photo was taken. Charleston, South Carolina, spring 1990 or summer 1990. Yeah, I've known Chris Grimes for a long time. Anyway, here you go.
Amazon debuted its new TV series, The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power, this week. And the show looks, well, epic.
Evil does not sleep. It waits.
Beyond the darkness, tempting shadow, to bury us all beneath the mountain.
You can see just how much time and attention to detail was spent on it, even in the trailer. There are massive battle scenes, incredible costumes, and stunning landscapes.
You have been told many lies of Middle-earth.
And there's a very good reason why this show looks so good. It was extremely expensive to make.
So if you look at the 2 seasons that are planned for this so far, that's a $1 billion show, which I believe is a first.
That's Chris Grimes. He's the FT's Los Angeles bureau chief and covers all things Hollywood. Chris recently wrote about how Amazon isn't the only streaming service spending money like crazy on their programming.
The new Game of Thrones season has just started on HBO Max, and that's a $200 million season for that show, and on and on. Disney's got a lot of big stuff coming out. The Star Wars Andor series is coming out this autumn, so it's going to be a big moment for consumers. It's frankly extravagant budgets, which is kind of amazing.
But Chris says these boom times for show budgets may not last. Theaters are producing big hits again, and a lot of streaming services aren't even getting enough subscribers to make a profit.
So now there's kind of a reevaluation of all of these things that we were kind of thinking of as gospel just 18 months ago in the streaming business.
Today we look at how the streaming landscape is changing and what that means for the types of shows we will watch at home. Will the quirky indie rom-com survive, or will it be vanquished by flashy superhero franchises? This is FT Weekend. I'm Topher Forhes, in for Lila Raptopoulos.
Hi, Chris. Welcome back to the show. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you are our expert in the streaming wars, and it's been such a wild and unpredictable time. And I want to run through each company and break down what's going on with each one. But first, let's step back. How did things change for streaming broadly when the pandemic hit?
So the pandemic, horrible for humanity, but amazing for streaming. People were locked down. People had very little to do. And so they tucked in and started binging shows on streaming platforms, particularly Netflix. The timing was good for Disney as well because they had just launched Disney Plus, their new streaming service. And so what would have probably taken several years in a kind of normal time period just compacted lots and lots of growth for the whole industry into a couple of years.
Back in the early days of the pandemic, we were all buzzing about shows like Tiger King, Ted Lasso, and The Mandalorian, and subscriptions were soaring. So platforms decided to go all in on streaming, even old school studios that had resisted it. The plan was to grow and grow fast. They dumped a ton of money into their shows and hoped that it would get them enough subscribers to eventually make a profit. And this actually created a bit of an arms race to see which platform could spend the most on its content. And now, Chris says what is coming out this fall is the result of that race.
It's going to be a big moment for consumers. Shows that were greenlit during the moment when Wall Street was really cheering on this dash for growth. Big spending on content, big losses on investment into streaming service. And a lot of that production was disrupted because of the pandemic. It was harder to make these shows during the pandemic. So we're going to see the releases of shows that were commissioned at the, bubbliest moment of the streaming era.
But Chris says there's a flip side to that.
Especially after Netflix announced earlier this year that their blistering growth had gone into reverse and that they were actually losing subscribers, not gaining subscribers. That was the moment that really changed the narrative here. And now Wall Street investors are saying this can't continue forever. We're going to have to start seeing some money. And so the companies are responding to that. Netflix, which, by the way, is profitable, has said that they will do something that they said they were always never going to do, and that is introduce an advertising tier. It's kind of a best of times, worst of times scenario for consumers where they're going to have all of these riches this autumn, but at the same time, they may be either facing the choice of having to watch ads while they do this or pay higher prices.
So let's talk about Netflix for a second. You mentioned that in order to stay profitable, they're going to introduce a subscription plan that would include ads, which, by the way, Disney is also going to do. But has Netflix said anything about the type of content it will produce to attract and keep subscribers?
In a recent call with investors, Ted Sarandos, who's the co-chief executive and the guy who's kind of oversees the content strategy, admitted that their content in many cases just wasn't good enough, which is I've found to be a remarkably forthright statement during an investor call. So they say I think they're going to make less, but they're going to try and make that content better, which is, it's an interesting thing. It's a notoriously difficult business. But Netflix still, like I say, they're profitable. They still plan to spend billions of dollars. I think they spent about 17 billion, or are on track to spend about 17 billion on content this year.
So do you think that they're just going to direct that money to just fewer projects? Is that the idea?
I think so, yeah. So Netflix has done some things like recently they worked with the Russo brothers, who were the brothers who were behind some of the biggest successes for Marvel. So the Russos came in and made The Gray Man. And I think we'll see more of that. They're trying to, with proven hit makers, to make a franchise out of this Gray Man series of books that's, that could run and run. Everybody, in fact, wants what Disney has with Marvel. Over at Warner Brothers, you've got David Zaslav, the new CEO, who came from Discovery. Warner Brothers has DC Comics, and he wants a DC franchise the way that Disney has with Marvel. And he says he's going to invest in that, and he's challenging the people at Warner to come up with a DC strategy that's a big hit-making strategy like that. So this is what everybody wants. Netflix wants this, and, big franchises that are going to keep subscribers locked in, for years.
Right. So let's talk about HBO for a second and Warner Brothers Discovery. They made big news recently by reshuffling and axing some of their content. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened there?
Yes. So Discovery bought Warner Brothers after the pretty short but not very great ownership of Warner Brothers by AT&T. And to make this acquisition, Discovery, which is a smaller company, had to take on $55 billion worth of debt. And Zaslav's got to pay that off somehow. So he's looking for ways to cut costs. And at the studio, he looked at Batgirl and said, which is a movie that's finished and was about to be released, and he axed it. And this is a DC movie. He emphasized a few times on a call that he's willing to stand by a movie as long as it's got quality. So, obviously I haven't seen it, and very few people have seen Batgirl, but he decided to take a write-off on it.
Chris says people in Hollywood were really shocked by this move. This was a movie that Warner Brothers had already spent $90 million to make and had already started advertising. So do we have any idea of what that might mean for the types of shows that we'll be seeing on, let's say, HBO Max?
I think what the people that we've been talking to in recent days is that this push for taking over not just Warner, but across the industry, means that studios are probably going to do what they've always done and go for blockbusters, big hits, that may mean, according to a professor I spoke to last week, who was saying, one of the things that's made the streaming era so wonderful in a lot of ways is that there were quirky little shows, and he was speculating that, well, maybe we won't see as many of those things because the studios are going to want to attract subscribers and lock them in.
And along those lines with HBO Max, which I believe took off during the pandemic, now that they're bringing in Discovery, do we know if HBO Max's days are numbered and they might turn into a different streaming service altogether?
There's a lot of speculation about that. Of course, HBO has been, consistently one of the producers of some of the highest quality, most beloved series and shows for decades now.
Chris is talking about shows like The Wire, The Sopranos, Band of Brothers. HBO was responsible for a new golden age of television. And Chris says now people are nervous about what could happen to it.
I mean, it seems like what we know so far is that the plan is, instead of having a Discovery streaming service and an HBO streaming service, they're going to try to put these together in some kind of bundle or platform together, which, would be fine. I think in the darkest late night worries in Hollywood, you'd see HBO become more like Discovery and then the other way around, where you have more inexpensive programming about people's kitchens and their gardens or whatever.
So then there are the big tech companies that are moving into this space like Apple and Amazon, and they basically have limitless resources to produce original content. So how exactly are these studios supposed to compete with their budgets?
So since I've been covering this beat, when you ask people in the industry how it's all going to work out, there's a belief that, well, there will be inevitable consolidation. So somebody's going to have to eat somebody else. There's too many players to exist a few years from now, right? So somebody's going to lose. They're going to be losers and they're going to be eaten up. But looming in the background of that is the fact that you've got really deep-pocketed tech companies, Amazon, Apple, and even Google, which has YouTube, and you can subscribe to streaming through YouTube as well. So I think for the studios, as big as some of them are, Disney's huge, Warner Brothers and Paramount are these legendary Hollywood names. But do they end up being part of a deep-pocketed tech company at some point? That's always kind of in the backs of people's minds. But what we do know is that the traditional studios can't continue to spend money the way they're spending it on streaming services that are unprofitable.
So, as we wrap up here, have you spoken to actual creators at any of these services? I imagine it must be stressful working in a system that is just constantly changing and no one's really sure what it's going to look like or how much money they're going to have. What are they saying?
Yeah, this is a conversation I've had with people for several months now after the Netflix shock earlier this year. Now, there's one point of view, and I think there's a lot of merit to this, which is that no matter what happens, these streaming services are going to still need the appetite for streaming content is still big, and so if you're if you're a producer or if you're a writer, there's a belief that there's still going to be need for more scripted content than there was 10 years ago, right? The demand is higher than it was, thanks to streaming. The economics of that is a completely different discussion. Netflix has changed, the game in terms of potential bonuses and profit sharing and that kind of thing for writers and producers. But putting that aside, there's an expectation that, yes, there's still going to be a need for a lot more content than there was before.
Which leads me to my last question. Are we at the peak of peak TV?
The question of peak TV is a really funny one or interesting one. There's a veteran television executive named John Landgraf who works for the FX network, and he's been calling the peak of peak TV for about the last 5 years. He did it again in early August at a TV Critics event. Basically, at some point, he's got to be right that these budgets will have to top out. This unlimited growth in streaming series budgets has got to has got to top out somewhere. And given the big change that we've seen in investor appetite to basically endless losses, that game is over now. So I think peak TV, if it's not this year, it's coming.
All right. Chris Grimes, thank you so much.